The diner was quiet that morning. Sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting warm patterns on the wooden floor. The smell of freshly brewed coffee mixed with the faint aroma of toast and pancakes. Most of the early customers were regulars who came for the same thing every day, chatting quietly among themselves. The waitress moved swiftly between the tables, her steps confident and practiced. She smiled at each person, taking orders, refilling coffee cups, and making sure everyone felt seen. It was another ordinary morning for her, just another shift at the small diner she had been working at for years. Then, he walked in. There was a presence about him that immediately drew attention. He didn't need to say anything, yet people seemed to notice him. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, expensive shoes, and a watch that looked like it could buy a small house. His hair was neatly styled, and his posture spoke of someone used to authority. Even though the diner was casual, he carried an air of importance. Most people wouldn't have dared approach him, and yet here he was, moving toward the counter like he belonged, scanning the room with a subtle curiosity. The waitress noticed him immediately. She had served plenty of important people before, but there was something different about him. He didn't rush, didn't glare, and didn't seem annoyed by the casual atmosphere of the diner. He walked up to the counter and leaned on it lightly, smiling just enough to make the moment feel like a conversation had already begun. "Good morning," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "I'm thinking about finances. Could you give me some advice?" She blinked, slightly startled. The question was unusual, and the way he said it felt like a joke. Still, she was used to thinking on her feet. Most people came in asking for coffee or food, but some asked for small talk, advice on life, or even guidance about school or work. She had learned to listen first and answer carefully no matter who was asking. "Financial advice?" she asked, raising an eyebrow but keeping her tone friendly. "I'm not a financial expert, but I can try to help." "What kind of advice are you looking for?" The billionaire smiled, clearly entertained. He had expected a laugh, a confused look, or maybe someone brushing him off. Instead, he found someone who was ready to engage. There was honesty in her voice, a straightforwardness that didn't come from arrogance but from life experience. He leaned a little closer, resting his arms on the counter, and said, "I want to know how to grow wealth wisely, how to manage money smartly. In short, how to make decisions that matter." She took a deep breath, thinking for a moment. It wasn't just a casual question. There was weight behind it, even if he was joking. She decided to give an answer that was simple, direct, and grounded in reality. "Well," she began, "the first thing I'd say is don't chase shortcuts. Many people think they can get rich quickly, but it's safer and smarter to focus on steady growth. Keep track of what you spend, invest in things you understand, and don't be afraid to ask for help from people who know more." He tilted his head, listening intently. There was a pause in the diner, a subtle shift as if the usual background noise had faded for a moment. The waitress continued, unaware of the effect her words were having. "Also, don't forget the people around you. Wealth isn't just numbers in a bank account. It's about creating opportunities for yourself and others. If you can help someone else succeed while growing your own resources, that's the best kind of investment." The CEO, still leaning on the counter, felt a surprising calm wash over him. He was used to advisors who spoke in complex jargon, using charts, graphs, and complicated terms. He was used to people flattering him, telling him what he wanted to hear. But this was different. Simple, practical, and honest. He found himself nodding subtly, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Other customers were beginning to notice the exchange. It wasn't every day that someone so well-dressed and authoritative stood at the counter, listening so intently to a waitress. Some whispered among themselves while others paused in their routines to see what was happening. Yet, neither the waitress nor the billionaire seemed distracted by the attention. The conversation had its own rhythm, a flow that drew both of them in. "So," he asked after a pause, "what would you do if you were me? If you had resources and opportunities most people only dream of?" She thought carefully. This was no longer a casual question. It was a challenge, a test of her perspective. She didn't hesitate. "I'd focus on understanding what matters most to me. I'd make sure my decisions weren't just about money, but about impact. I'd invest in things that last, not just things that shine for a moment. And I'd listen to people who see things differently from me, because sometimes the best ideas come from unexpected places." He laughed softly, but it was a laugh filled with admiration rather than amusement. He leaned back slightly, studying her face. There was confidence there, but not arrogance. Insight, but not pretension. He realized that this woman, standing behind the counter of a small diner, had given him more clarity in a few sentences than some of his highly paid advisors had given him in hours of meetings. She noticed his reaction and smiled, slightly embarrassed. She had been honest, but she hadn't expected this. Most people didn't take advice from waitresses seriously. Most people didn't ask follow-up questions. Most people didn't pause and reflect on the words. But this man did, and that made her feel a strange mix of nervousness and pride. "You make it sound so simple," he said after a moment, his voice quieter now. "But I know it's not. People usually complicate things. They make it about status, power, or competition. You make it sound like it's about clarity and choices." She shrugged lightly. "Because it is. The basics are simple. Living within your means, planning ahead, thinking about others, and learning from mistakes. Everything else is just noise." He nodded, leaning slightly forward again. There was a seriousness now in his gaze that hadn't been there when he first walked in. He felt challenged, awakened in a way he hadn't in years. He realized that this brief encounter could shift something inside him, even if it seemed impossible at the moment. The conversation continued, and the diner slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Orders were taken, coffee cups refilled, plates cleared. But for these two people, the world had narrowed to this counter, this moment, this exchange of ideas. Time seemed to stretch, and yet it flew by. There was an intensity in listening, a focus on understanding, that made minutes feel like hours and hours feel like minutes. When the CEO finally left, he did so with a thoughtful smile. He paid quickly, leaving a generous tip, and walked out of the diner. But his mind was still inside that small room, with the smell of coffee, the warmth of sunlight, and the words of a waitress who had spoken simple truths with clarity and confidence. He knew, without fully understanding how, that something had shifted, that something in the way he saw money, life, and decision-making had been touched in a way that would stay with him. The waitress watched him go, a quiet sense of satisfaction filling her chest. She didn't realize the full impact of their conversation at that moment. She only knew that she had been honest. She had shared what she knew, and she had treated him like any other person who came through the door. That honesty, that simple human connection had changed the energy in the room. It had left a mark, one that neither of them could fully measure yet. The morning continued. Customers came and went, the coffee flowed, and the sounds of clinking dishes filled the diner. But something had shifted, an invisible thread connecting two very different lives. One was rooted in the experience of everyday life, the small lessons learned from hard work and observation. The other was rooted in wealth and power, privilege and opportunity. And yet, in a quiet moment over coffee and conversation, the two met on equal ground. The world outside continued its rush, but inside that small diner, a conversation had planted a seed that would grow into something unexpected, something meaningful, something life-changing. After leaving the diner, the billionaire CEO walked down the busy city street, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. The conversation he had just had replayed over and over in his head, each word from the waitress echoing in a way that seemed far more important than any casual advice he had ever received. He passed the usual hurried crowd, businessmen in suits, students with backpacks, street vendors shouting about their products, yet nothing else seemed to matter. All he could think about was the clarity, the simplicity, and the honesty that had come from a voice he never expected to listen to so intently. The meeting he had scheduled for later that day waited in a sleek glass building downtown, but he found it hard to focus. His assistant had already sent him emails with reports, summaries, and agendas, yet none of it carried the weight that the morning's encounter had brought. He realized he had been living surrounded by advice, analysis, and strategies, but most of it was abstract, disconnected from real life, disconnected from the people who actually made the economy, the society, and the world function. He had been managing numbers, charts, and predictions, and in doing so, he had forgotten the most basic truths about growth, patience, and human connection. Meanwhile, back at the diner, the waitress continued her shift. Plates clattered, coffee machines hissed, and the chatter of customers filled the air. Yet despite the busy morning, she felt a quiet sense of curiosity about the man who had asked for her advice. She had spoken honestly, not to impress, not to gain anything, but because that's how she approached life. Still, She couldn't help but wonder what someone like him would think about what she had said. Would he even remember it once he returned to his world of meetings and million-dollar deals? Or had it been just another brief encounter that would fade like morning sunlight? By midday, the CEO returned to his office, but the morning's conversation refused to let go of him. He couldn't stop thinking about how she had framed money and decisions in such a human way. It wasn't about greed, status, or competition. It was about understanding, responsibility, and clarity. He realized that all the high-level strategies and endless analysis in his life had not produced the same effect as a few honest sentences from someone who had a completely different perspective. That thought alone unsettled him, and in the best way possible. He found himself recalling specific moments from their conversation. How she had emphasized helping others while growing his own wealth. How she had talked about understanding what matters most, and how she had insisted on the value of learning from people with different experiences. It was a perspective he had never fully appreciated. For someone who had built his empire on logic, prediction, and careful planning, this simplicity struck him like a revelation. It felt almost revolutionary. During a strategy meeting later in the day, his mind drifted repeatedly. His team presented projections, charts, and plans, but he struggled to engage. He began asking questions that were different from his usual inquiries. Instead of focusing solely on numbers, he asked about the human impact, about long-term effects, about the real needs of the employees and customers. His team, accustomed to more technical questions, paused, sensing the shift in his mindset. He felt a strange satisfaction as he listened to discussions that were no longer abstract, but connected to people and real-life decisions. The next few days were a blur of reflection. He revisited his investments, his company strategies, and his daily routines. Everywhere he looked, he tried to imagine the world through a perspective that valued clarity, responsibility, and human connection over flashy returns and rapid growth. The words of the waitress kept coming back to him, reminding him that wealth was not merely a measure of money, but of impact and meaningful decisions. He realized that his own approach had been lacking that human touch, that wisdom born from practical experience and simple understanding. Meanwhile, the waitress continued her life, unbothered by the outside world's view of the interaction. She greeted each customer with warmth, served food with care, and listened to the stories people shared while sipping their coffee. She had no idea that a single conversation had left a mark on someone who controlled resources, businesses, and decisions on a scale she could hardly imagine. Her perspective, born from everyday life and personal observation, was making waves in a world far removed from her daily routine. A few days later, the CEO returned to the diner. This time it wasn't casual curiosity or a joke that brought him back. He walked in with purpose, his usual air of authority softened by a subtle humility. The waitress noticed him immediately, a slight smile crossing her face. She had not expected to see him again, and yet, there he was standing by the counter with a thoughtful expression. "I needed to see you again," he said, his voice quieter now, more sincere. "Your advice? It has changed the way I think. I realized how much I've been missing by focusing only on numbers. You made me see the human side of decisions." She blinked, slightly taken aback. This was not the usual type of gratitude she received. Most people left, and most advice was forgotten. But his words were different. They were heavy with reflection and intention. She offered a polite smile. "I'm glad it helped," she said. "I didn't think much of it at the time. It's just how I try to think about things." He shook his head slightly, a mix of amazement and respect in his gaze. "No, it's more than that. You reminded me of something I had lost sight of. The simplicity of clear thinking, the responsibility to others, and the value of perspective. You made it feel real again." They talked for a long while that day, and unlike the first encounter, this conversation went deeper. He asked her questions about life, priorities, and how she saw the world. She answered honestly, with stories from her own experiences, examples of people she had seen succeed or fail, and reflections on what she had learned from daily challenges. She spoke without judgment or pretension, and the sincerity resonated with him. He realized that wisdom didn't always come from textbooks or financial seminars. It could come from observation, experience, and practical understanding. As the afternoon faded, the CEO left the diner again, but the effect was profound. He returned to his office with a renewed sense of purpose, eager to apply what he had learned. He began to approach meetings differently, to listen more to people and to consider the impact of decisions on real lives. He found himself reflecting on the human element in ways he had long ignored. The simplicity and honesty of a waitress's perspective had opened doors in his mind that had been closed for years. Back at the diner, life continued as usual. The waitress moved among her customers, taking orders and chatting with familiar faces. Yet there was a quiet satisfaction within her. She had spoken her truth, shared her perspective, and unknowingly sparked a shift in someone who had the power to make significant changes in the world. The ripple effect of her honesty was invisible yet potent, and it reminded her of the small but important ways one person could influence another. Over the next week, the CEO implemented small changes in his company. He encouraged discussions that prioritized the human impact of decisions. He asked employees for practical suggestions and considered solutions grounded in reality, rather than projections alone. Slowly, he noticed changes: improved morale, increased engagement, and more meaningful outcomes. He realized that he had underestimated the value of simple, honest insight from someone outside his usual circle. And so, life continued, intertwining in unexpected ways. The waitress continued her work with care and integrity, while the CEO began a journey of reflection, learning, and transformation inspired by her words. Both moved forward, shaped subtly but profoundly by a single conversation in a quiet diner one ordinary morning. It was a reminder that wisdom and insight could appear in the most unexpected places, and that the most impactful lessons were often the simplest ones, shared from one human being to another with honesty and care. Weeks passed, but the CEO could not stop thinking about the waitress and the conversation that had changed his perspective. Each day at the office, her words echoed in his mind, subtly guiding him in ways he had not anticipated. The charts, numbers, and forecasts he had relied on suddenly felt incomplete without the human perspective she had shared. He began noticing patterns in his company, not just in data, but in the lives of the employees, the outcomes of decisions, and the way his leadership affected real people. What had seemed like a small casual conversation was now shaping the way he approached his empire. He started keeping a small notebook where he jotted down thoughts inspired by her advice. Simple ideas at first: listen more, understand the impact, question assumptions. Gradually, these notes turned into action plans. Meetings were different now. He asked questions that challenged his team to consider the human consequences of their strategies. Projects that had once been approached purely for profit now included discussions about sustainability, employee welfare, and long-term growth. His team noticed the shift, some curious, some skeptical, but gradually they saw results. Morale improved, communication became more open, and employees started contributing ideas that had previously gone unheard. The CEO realized that he had underestimated the power of perspective outside his usual circle. He had spent years surrounding himself with advisors, analysts, and specialists, yet none had offered insight with the clarity and authenticity of the waitress's simple words. Her perspective was not bound by titles, experience in high finance, or influence. It was grounded in observation, practical life experience, and human understanding. He found himself reflecting not just on business but on life itself, asking whether he had overlooked other voices that could offer wisdom. Back at the diner, the waitress went about her days as usual. She served regulars who came in for their morning coffee, chatted with students and delivery workers, and listened to the small stories of everyday life. Yet she remained unaware of the larger ripple she had created. She had offered advice honestly, without expectation, and the impact it had made on someone of such influence was something she could never have predicted. For her, it was simply an ordinary act of sharing insight where it was asked. One morning, the CEO returned to the diner. This time, he was not there to test her or to make light conversation. He came with a purpose, a desire to engage further with someone who had reshaped his thinking. The waitress greeted him warmly, surprised but pleased to see him again. She sensed the difference in him. The arrogance that often accompanied people of his stature was replaced with thoughtfulness and humility. It was a rare sight, even for someone who had met countless influential figures. They sat together in a quiet corner of the diner, away from most of the regular hustle. He spoke about the changes he had begun implementing in his company and in his personal life. He described the new way he was listening to employees, the initiatives he had started to support long-term growth, and the emphasis he was placing on human understanding over pure profit. The waitress listened carefully, her interest genuine. She asked questions that encouraged him to reflect further, to dig deeper into his motivations and to clarify his goals. Their conversation was a dance of ideas, mutual respect, and sincere curiosity. The CEO realized that her questions were more powerful than any advice he had ever received. She didn't offer ready-made solutions but prompted him to think critically and ethically. She asked how he would feel about a decision if he were in someone else's shoes, how he could use his influence responsibly, and what he hoped to leave behind beyond money and success. Each question was a mirror, reflecting his values and priorities back at him in ways that made him reconsider old habits and assumptions. By the end of the conversation, he felt a profound shift. It wasn't just about business decisions anymore. It was about life choices, about legacy, and about the kind of person he wanted to be. He realized that the simplest wisdom, when spoken with honesty and clarity, could have the deepest impact. It reminded him that human connection, empathy, and perspective were as important as intelligence, strategy, and skill in shaping meaningful outcomes. Returning to his office, he immediately began translating their conversation into action. He organized workshops and meetings that focused on practical understanding, encouraging employees to share their ideas freely and to think about how decisions affected real people. He introduced mentorship programs, employee support initiatives, and community outreach efforts that had previously been low priorities. Slowly but steadily, he noticed the company culture transforming. People felt valued, heard, and inspired to contribute more meaningfully. The CEO also began reflecting on his own life. He had long pursued achievements measured in numbers, rankings, and titles. Yet he realized he had overlooked the importance of everyday wisdom and authentic insight. The waitress's advice had reminded him that influence and success were most meaningful when paired with responsibility, humility, and understanding. He began paying attention to small details in his personal life, how he interacted with family, how he supported friends, and how he managed time. These changes, though subtle at first, added depth and fulfillment that he had not anticipated. Meanwhile, the waitress continued her routine, her days filled with the ordinary rhythm of work and life. But she had begun to notice small changes herself. Occasionally, she would see him in the diner and notice a different energy, a quiet focus, and a thoughtfulness in his demeanor. She realized that their conversations had sparked a transformation, even if she didn't yet see the full impact. It was a reminder of the unexpected ways human connection could ripple outward, influencing people and events far beyond immediate perception. The city around them carried on as usual, bustling with traffic, business, and the noise of daily life. Yet within these ordinary spaces, extraordinary changes were unfolding. One small conversation at a humble diner had become the catalyst for reflection, growth, and a shift in perspective. The CEO and the waitress, though from vastly different worlds, had found common ground in honesty, insight, and the courage to engage openly. Their connection highlighted a profound truth. Wisdom and inspiration are not confined to status, experience, or privilege, but can emerge from the simplest, most authentic exchanges between people. Days turned into weeks, and the CEO's initiatives began producing tangible results. Employee satisfaction increased, community projects thrived, and the company started to see growth that was not just financial but meaningful in multiple dimensions. He credited part of this success to the conversations with the waitress, acknowledging that her insights had challenged him to think differently, to approach leadership with a renewed sense of purpose and ethical responsibility. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of alignment between his actions, values, and the kind of impact he wanted to create. At the same time, the waitress continued living her life with quiet grace. She didn't see herself as extraordinary, and yet she had left a mark on someone whose decisions could influence thousands. Her humility and integrity, the same qualities that had guided her every day, had become a catalyst for meaningful change. The simplicity and honesty of her perspective, offered without expectation, had demonstrated the power of human connection, empathy, and shared understanding. She became a silent force for positive change, shaping outcomes in ways that went unnoticed by most, yet profoundly significant. One afternoon, the CEO returned once more to the diner, this time with a sense of gratitude that went beyond mere words. He wanted to thank her personally, not as a formality but as an acknowledgement of the profound impact she had had on his life and leadership. The waitress, noticing his approach, felt a quiet warmth. She listened as he described the changes he had made, the new perspective he had adopted, and the renewed focus on people, responsibility, and long-term thinking. Her words had inspired reflection, action, and transformation, and now, seeing the results, she understood the true extent of that impact. As they talked, the diner seemed to fade into the background. It was no longer just a place of breakfast and coffee. It had become a space where ideas, wisdom, and transformation converged. The CEO left that day with a renewed sense of purpose, ready to continue his journey of growth, guided not just by data and strategy, but by insight, empathy, and human understanding. The waitress returned to her routine, quietly witnessing the ripple of change she had initiated, her own life enriched by the knowledge that a simple, honest conversation could alter the course of someone else's world. In this way, their story continued, a reminder that wisdom and impact often emerge from unexpected places. It is not always the loudest voice, the highest title, or the grandest achievement that inspires change, but sometimes the quiet, grounded perspective of an ordinary person who sees clearly, speaks honestly, and connects sincerely. The CEO and the waitress, though from different worlds, had discovered a shared truth. Meaningful insight transcends status. Wealth and position and the simplest words, offered with clarity and integrity, can leave a lasting imprint on the world. Weeks turned into months, and the impact of that simple conversation in the diner continued to unfold in ways that surprised both the CEO and the waitress. At the office, the CEO's approach to leadership had become almost unrecognizable compared to his old style. He had started asking employees about their personal challenges, their aspirations, and their concerns, not just their work performance. He encouraged brainstorming sessions that were free of hierarchy, where ideas were judged by merit rather than title. Slowly, the company's culture shifted from one driven purely by profits to one that valued people, ethics, and sustainable growth. Employees began to feel empowered, and productivity improved not because of pressure, but because they felt their voices mattered. The CEO noticed the changes immediately. Meetings that had once been tense and filled with defensive posturing now had an atmosphere of collaboration and respect. Ideas flowed freely. Mistakes were discussed openly, and learning from each other became a central value. He realized that leadership was not just about making the right decisions, but about creating an environment where good decisions could naturally emerge. The transformation of his company mirrored the simplicity and insight of the advice given by the waitress months ago. Her words had sparked a chain reaction, shaping the environment in a way he could never have anticipated. He began sharing the story of his encounter at the diner with a few trusted colleagues, not to brag, but to highlight the value of listening to unexpected perspectives. He emphasized how wisdom could come from anyone, regardless of position or status, and encouraged his team to remain open to insights from unusual sources. The story became a quiet legend within the company, a reminder that inspiration could appear in the simplest and most unexpected forms. Meanwhile, life at the diner continued with its usual rhythm. The waitress carried on with her daily routine, serving food, pouring coffee, and listening to the small stories of her customers. She had no idea how far her words had traveled, how deeply they had influenced someone whose decisions touched thousands of lives. She remained grounded, focusing on the people in front of her, unaware of the larger ripple she had created. Her perspective, honed through life's lessons and daily observation, was now subtly shaping a world far beyond the diner's walls. One afternoon, the CEO returned to the diner, this time with a quiet but determined purpose. He wanted to express his gratitude and to share the impact her words had had on his life and his company. She greeted him warmly, noticing a new light in his expression, a combination of humility, focus, and genuine appreciation. As they sat together, he described the changes he had made: employee programs, community initiatives, mentorship plans, and the cultural shift in the company. He spoke with excitement and sincerity, showing how her advice had acted as a catalyst for these developments. The waitress listened, surprised and humbled by the depth of his reflection. She had not expected such a profound effect from their brief conversation months ago. Her words had been offered without expectation, yet they had inspired change on a scale she could never have imagined. She asked questions, curious about his thought process and the challenges he faced while implementing these changes. Their conversation became an exchange of ideas, reflections, and practical solutions, highlighting the ongoing journey of learning and growth for both of them. Inspired by her curiosity and insight, the CEO began to think even more deeply about the responsibilities of wealth and influence. He realized that money and power could be tools for positive change if used thoughtfully. He began exploring opportunities to invest in projects that supported education, community development, and environmental sustainability. These decisions were no longer just strategic, they were ethical and purposeful. The ripple effect of one honest conversation in a small diner was now influencing decisions that had the potential to touch countless lives. The waitress continued to embody the values that had guided her advice: integrity, observation, empathy, and clarity. She did not seek recognition or reward. Her focus remained on helping those around her in small but meaningful ways. Yet she began to notice subtle signs that her influence had spread. Occasionally, she would see stories in the local news about initiatives inspired by new leadership decisions, programs that had grown from ideas she had helped ignite. She remained humble but quietly satisfied, knowing that the world could change in meaningful ways when honesty and insight were shared sincerely. Meanwhile, the CEO's personal life began to reflect the lessons he had learned from her. He approached relationships with more attentiveness and understanding, listening deeply to family and friends, valuing their perspectives and experiences. He discovered that the same principles that guided his leadership could be applied to daily interactions: empathy, patience, and genuine interest in the well-being of others. He felt a newfound sense of alignment between his personal values and professional actions, a harmony that had been missing before. Back at the diner, the waitress continued to engage with customers in her usual manner, unaware of how extraordinary her impact had become. She served pancakes to students, poured coffee for elderly regulars, and listened to the small joys and struggles of everyday life. Her humility and consistency had created a quiet force of change that extended far beyond the diner's walls. The CEO's transformation was a visible example, but the larger ripple effect was invisible, touching countless lives indirectly through the decisions he now made with renewed wisdom. One evening, the CEO reflected on the months since that first conversation. He thought about the simple words that had sparked a profound shift: clarity, responsibility, understanding, and human connection. He realized that the most meaningful lessons often come from unexpected sources, and that true insight does not require titles, experience, or authority. It only requires honesty, observation, and the courage to share one's perspective. He felt grateful not only for the advice itself, but for the reminder that wisdom can emerge from the simplest acts of communication and sincerity. In the following months, the CEO's initiatives began producing noticeable results. The company grew not only in profit but in reputation and impact. Employees were more engaged and fulfilled, community projects flourished, and the focus on long-term sustainability became a model for other organizations. The ripple effect of one conversation had created a network of positive change, all stemming from the insight and honesty of a waitress who had shared her perspective without expectation. The waitress, meanwhile, continued to live her life in the ordinary rhythm of work and daily interactions. She did not see herself as a catalyst for change, yet her influence was undeniable. Each day she practiced the same principles she had shared with the CEO: listening carefully, observing closely, responding with integrity, and connecting sincerely with those around her. Through her everyday actions, she had demonstrated that meaningful impact is not reserved for the powerful or wealthy. It can emerge from anyone who approaches life with honesty, clarity, and compassion. The story of their encounter became quietly legendary within the company and the local community. Employees who learned about it were inspired to consider perspectives outside their usual circles, to listen more, and to act with integrity. Community leaders and local observers began to recognize the power of small, honest acts in creating meaningful change. And while the waitress remained humble and unaware of the full extent of her influence, she had left an indelible mark on someone whose decisions now shaped countless lives. Through these months, both the CEO and the waitress learned valuable lessons. He learned that leadership and wealth are most meaningful when guided by ethics, clarity, and empathy. She learned that honest, practical insight can inspire change far beyond its immediate context. Together, their interaction became a testament to the power of human connection, the value of listening, and the unexpected ways that wisdom can emerge from the simplest, most sincere exchanges. Their story demonstrated that real impact often begins with honesty, observation, and the courage to speak from the heart, regardless of one's position or status in the world. By the time the season changed and the city shifted from summer warmth to autumn coolness, the diner remained a quiet, familiar place. Yet within its walls, a story of transformation had begun, a story of insight, growth, and human connection that would continue to ripple outward, touching lives in ways neither the CEO nor the waitress could fully measure. The lessons of that small diner, shared through honest words and open minds, had created a lasting change, proving that the simplest, most human interactions can lead to the most profound transformations in life, work, and the world. Months had passed since the first conversation in the diner, yet the impact of that moment continued to grow in ways both the CEO and the waitress could hardly have imagined. The CEO's life had shifted profoundly, not just in his company but in his personal understanding of responsibility, influence, and human connection. He now viewed decisions through a lens that balanced practical wisdom with ethical considerations, always remembering the simple clarity of the waitress's advice. Each choice he made was informed not only by strategy and data, but by the understanding of real people affected by those decisions. The company had transformed in ways that could be measured and felt. Employee satisfaction had risen dramatically. Turnover had decreased and productivity had increased not from pressure or fear, but from a sense of purpose. Staff meetings were more collaborative and ideas from employees at all levels were welcomed and implemented. Community projects that once had been neglected now flourished, with the company investing in local education programs, support for small businesses, and environmental initiatives. These changes had ripple effects across the city, creating a model of leadership that blended wealth, power, and humanity. The CEO himself had changed in quieter but equally significant ways. He spent more time with family, listening carefully and appreciating their perspectives. He connected with friends and colleagues on a deeper level, offering support and understanding where before he might have only offered advice or critique. In his personal life, he noticed subtle shifts. He was more patient, more attentive, and more willing to engage in thoughtful reflection rather than react impulsively. The insight he had gained from that brief diner conversation had become a guiding principle, one that touched every aspect of his daily life. The waitress continued her work at the diner, living in the rhythm of her ordinary life. She served customers with warmth and attentiveness, listened to their stories, and offered small insights and advice where it seemed needed. She remained humble, unaware of the full scale of her influence. Occasionally, she would see a news article or hear a story from a customer that hinted at the larger changes occurring in the CEO's company. A small sense of satisfaction and quiet pride would fill her, but she never sought recognition. She knew her advice was honest and thoughtful, and that had been enough. One afternoon, the CEO returned to the diner once more, this time with a sense of closure and gratitude. He approached the waitress with a calm, reflective demeanor, carrying a quiet appreciation for the role she had played in reshaping his approach to life and leadership. The diner buzzed with the usual activity, yet in that moment, the conversation between the two of them felt like the center of the world. He shared stories of the changes in his company, the positive impacts on employees, and the broader influence of his new approach to leadership. The waitress listened with a mixture of surprise and humility. She could not have imagined that a simple exchange of ideas over coffee and breakfast could ripple outward in such profound ways. She asked questions that encouraged him to reflect even further, probing into his motivations and the lessons he had internalized. Their conversation became a continuation of the initial dialogue, a shared exploration of human connection, ethical decision-making, and practical wisdom. It was no longer just advice. It was a collaboration of understanding. During that conversation, the CEO realized something important. The most meaningful impact often begins quietly and unexpectedly. He had spent years seeking wisdom from experts, analysts, and advisors, Yet the insight that had truly reshaped his perspective came from someone whose life was entirely different from his own. He understood that influence and wealth were not ends in themselves, but tools for creating lasting, meaningful change. And he understood that those tools were most effective when guided by honesty, empathy, and practical wisdom. The waitress, in turn, began to recognize the power of her own perspective. Though she lived a humble, ordinary life, her observations and reflections had sparked change far beyond what she had imagined. She realized that wisdom does not come from status or education alone, but from paying attention, understanding the people around us, and speaking honestly when the moment calls for it. Her life had not changed dramatically in a material sense, but she now understood the quiet, far-reaching impact of her actions and words. As months continued, the CEO implemented larger projects inspired by his renewed perspective. He invested in training programs to help employees develop practical skills and leadership qualities, ensuring that growth was not just financial, but personal and professional. Community initiatives expanded to include mentorship programs for young people, scholarships for education, and environmental projects that benefited local neighborhoods. Each decision reflected the values he had internalized from his conversations with the waitress: clarity, responsibility, and care for others. The diner became a quiet symbol of change. Though the space itself remained simple and ordinary, the stories that emerged from within it were extraordinary. Customers who knew the story began to see it as a place where meaningful human connections could occur, where wisdom could emerge from honesty and observation, and where even the smallest interactions could have unexpected, transformative effects. The waitress remained at the center of this story, embodying the principles that had inspired so much change, living with integrity, humility, and awareness. Eventually, the CEO reflected on the broader lessons he had learned. He understood that true leadership is not defined by power or wealth alone, but by the ability to see clearly, act responsibly, and consider the human impact of every decision. He saw that meaningful influence often arises from openness to unexpected perspectives, and from humility in recognizing that insight can come from anywhere. The waitress had reminded him of these lessons in the simplest and most authentic way, leaving an imprint that would guide him for the rest of his life. The waitress, though unaware of the full extent of her impact, continued to live with the same honesty and awareness that had sparked the change. She interacted with each person who walked into the diner, sharing kindness, insight, and attention without expectation. In doing so, she became a quiet force for good, demonstrating that ordinary people can create extraordinary effects through integrity, observation, and the courage to speak from the heart. Their story became known quietly in the community, a testament to the power of human connection and the unexpected ways that wisdom can influence lives. People began to see that meaningful change does not always come from grand gestures or official authority, but from honest conversation, attentive listening, and thoughtful action. The CEO and the waitress had demonstrated that impact can emerge from the simplest of interactions, and that true insight transcends status, wealth, and position. By the end of the year, the ripple effect of that diner conversation had reached far beyond what either of them could have imagined. The CEO's company continued to thrive, now recognized not just for its financial success but for its ethical leadership, its positive workplace culture, and its contribution to the community. Employees felt valued and empowered, and local residents benefited from initiatives inspired by the company's renewed focus on responsibility and care. The waitress, meanwhile, remained grounded in her daily life, continuing her work with humility and grace. She had changed countless lives, though she would never fully know how. Her perspective, offered freely and honestly, had sparked transformation, proving that ordinary people can have extraordinary influence when they act with clarity, integrity, and sincerity. In the quiet of the diner, amidst the clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation, and the smell of fresh coffee, the story of two lives intersecting continued to inspire. The CEO had learned the value of humility, human connection, and ethical leadership. The waitress had seen the quiet power of honest insight. Together, they had created a ripple of change that reached far beyond a single morning or a single conversation, a story that demonstrated how ordinary moments, spoken sincerely and received openly, can transform lives in profound and lasting ways.